We're back after a brief hiatus, striving to bring you the latest on what's going on in the government purchasing, and the like. I'm Bill Culhane, co-host of the show. Lauren and Rick are behind the glass, and, well, in the interest of full disclosure, Lauren is actually linked in remotely today, getting her pool dug this afternoon. We're here in the capital of Texas, Austin, and this is the Big Bid Theory, powered by Bid Prime. You may recall last season we had an episode dedicated to post-Hurricane Harvey and received a lot of really good feedback as we helped to get the word out and hopefully along the way provided some useful education. As we quickly approach the end of June, many of you know the threat of wildfires continues today and looms on the horizon. As a matter of fact, I've got some numbers coming up to let you know what's going on right now. You're going to hear from a couple of experts on wildfires. What causes wildfires? What happens after the wildfire burns? What's being done to combat the threat? What should be done on not just a government level, but also on a personal level? We'll talk about that and a lot more. Not unlike last year's episode on hurricanes, we hope, if anything, that you understand that preparation is key. Too often, similar to hurricanes, we're far better at dealing with the aftermath than getting ready. As I sit here in front of the microphone and I looked at the National Interagency Fire Center, there are 10 new large fires, which ups the total in the U.S. to 53 wildfires, by the way. The result is 437,000 acres, over half the acreage of the state of Rhode Island, by the way, have burned within 10 states. The 2018 grand total to date is a staggering 27,822 fires. We're only in June. Last year, you ask, in 2017, according to what I'm seeing here, there were 28,453 fires, the most since 2011. As I queried in the Bid Prime database, there are hundreds upon hundreds of government-originated requests for fire-related equipment, services, a variety of solutions. Within, there are specific requests related to wildfire planning, tools for fighting, dealing with the aftermath. Everything from, I see brush trucks, we see management and organization experts, restoration efforts. Heck, there's even a request for a Smokey Bear wildfire prevention app. Now the experts. Dr. Kate Wilkin is a fire scientist with the University of California. Back in 2009, Dr. Wilkin received her master's from Cal Poly up there in San Luis Obispo. She earned her PhD at Cal Berkeley. Dr. Wilkin was a postdoctoral researcher focused on wildfire emissions and fire-forest water relations. She is literally in the trenches on this topic. Here's our visit. As you just heard, I gave an introduction to Dr. Kate Wilkin, who now joins us on the Big Bid Theory hotline from over in California. And Dr. Wilkin, first of all, welcome to the podcast. I mentioned to you yesterday in preparation for the segment, I'll be traveling out to California here in a few weeks. How's the weather there?
The weather here is already hot and dry and windy. Perfect fire weather.
I was just going to say hot, dry, and windy. Certainly that's part of the formula for wildfires. For the benefit of our audience, let's start in the beginning. What are some of the more common ways in which wildfires start?
How do fires start? Simply put, to create fire, you need some sort of heat, fuel, and oxygen. And oftentimes what it is will be, a cigarette butt in grass or a campfire that's been left over. So someone has started a fire, and then those unintended ignitions kind of carry through a natural area.
We know here, and I go back to 2011, and just to give everybody a little bit of a geography lesson, our studios here in Austin are about 30 minutes away from Bastrop, Texas, and around here we all remember the Bastrop County Complex fire back towards the middle end of 2011, and that was actually started due to an issue with power lines. Everyone in our audience, Dr. Wilkin, understands the threat to lives and property. In addition to the potential loss of lives and property, what impact do wildfires have? And I guess I'm going to expand on that and say there are also some positives as well. Wildfires are helpful in some respects, aren't they?
Absolutely. And so it's really hard because, I think a lot of people know fire or wildfire from the news and maybe even from California's news. Last year We had an extreme wildfire season. We lost more than 50 people in fires during the evacuations, and more than 10,000 homes and more than 1.2 million acres burned here. But at the same time, fire is something that's part of California's history. It's always been here. And, between lightning strikes that ignited grass fires and forest fires, thousands of years ago to more recently, maybe 1,000 years ago, we had our native Californians burned well before your American settlers came here. And so fire has always been part of California's history and part of the U.S.'s history in general. And things are changing now, but those historic fires were really, really different than what we see today.
Here I mentioned the Bastrop County fire back in 2011, but of course here in Texas as well, wildfires have certainly been a part of the story in this state currently. And then you go back, as you mentioned, you go back in time and wildfires have always been around. I drove through Bastrop, I guess the most recent time was a couple of weeks ago en route to Texas A&M over in College Station. But to make a long story short, you go back to 2011 when that horrific fire occurred, and you can still see where the regrowth, the rebuild is taking place in Bastrop. And here we are 7 years later. I saw a report, Dr. Wilkin, where back in 2017, so we're talking fiscal year 2017, the estimates were that it cost over $2 billion for wildland fire suppression efforts. You're in the know. You're there in the trenches, so to speak. What is being done right now? And if you had your way, what should be done to mitigate the threat of wildfires?
So to me, looking forward, a solution for wildfire is, making sure that we're prepared. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so to me, being prepared means making sure that individuals have fire-resistant homes and defensible space. It means that we have community-scale fuel break and also have large landscape-scale fuel treatment, which in many cases here in California is actually a way to restore our forests and grasslands to what they were before your American settlers, and also to prepare them for climate change. And so I would really be thinking about how we can spend our money to be prepared from an individual's home to our landscape. And that's working at a lot of different scales with a lot of different people.
You mentioned California, and obviously for good reason being there in California. I was out in Westwood, out there in the LA area a few weeks ago, and drive around Los Angeles north and south of the city, and you can just see how dry it looks. And as we've already established, of course, that's part of the recipe for the threat of wildfires and the spread of wildfires as well. Governments, as we know in our day jobs here, governments are investing a lot of money and looking for resources to address the wildfire threat and how to deal with the aftermath as well. What are the strategies and tools being deployed to fight wildfires?
During a wildfire, you're going to see hundreds, if not thousands, of men and women deployed as firefighters to either evacuate people in harm's way or to dig line, to create a fuel break. And so I think, there have always been a huge amount of people involved with fighting fire. And then in addition to that, there's engines and the helicopters that might be doing water drops, and also air tankers that might be doing fire retardant drops. And they all work together.
Do you think there are enough resources available? Has there been enough of a commitment to addressing the wildfire issue?
When I look at California's budget for fire, what I see is that we have a lot of resources to fight fire in the moment, but we have very few resources to prepare for fire. And so one of my main concerns is how can we put more money in prevention? Because California has fires, and so we just need to be more prepared as individuals, as communities, as counties, and as states. And so to me, that's really where more of our money should be spent. And recently, our governor had a new initiative where he was going to be putting more money into prevention because politically they're recognizing how important prevention is. And so that new governor's initiative includes money for prescribed fire crews, for more outreach to the public so they can understand how to make their homes more resistant to fire and more defensible space. And I think really looking forward, those are the solutions that we need.
Just in doing background in lead up to our conversation today, that you've been involved with a lot of community education efforts. I saw a number of stories out there. How does the rest of 2018 look? I read a report from Predictive Services, and it looks like, we're approaching a dangerous time. I'm not sure when people are listening to this episode of the podcast, but it's the end of June, and so July, August, September on the horizon. So based on your research and throw in your experience as well, Dr. Wilkin, how does the remainder of 2018 look?
Here in California, we have an extreme fire season predicted for a large portion of the state because we've had a lot of grass that grew during this past year because of the timing of the rain and the temperatures. And so a lot of the areas that burned during 2017 could easily re-burn today with the same ferocity, because a lot of those were in the lower elevation grasslands and oak woodlands here.
Everybody be careful out there. Now, to wrap up our visit, Dr. Wilkin, folks have Google available. They can do their own research. But is there anything you would like to share with the audience in terms of beneficial references that you're aware of, publications, research, anything along those lines you'd like to pass along to the Big Bit Theory audience?
A lot of my work as a PhD student at the University of California at Berkeley really focused on the natural benefits of fire. And so I had said previously that fire is part of California. And so I was looking at how in Yosemite and Kings Canyon National Park, how areas where they've allowed frequent fire to occur, how that has influenced, the current fires and also the ecosystems there. And what we found was that, frequent fire, the fires became more self-limiting because each fire consumed the fuel and starved future fires of that fuel. And then in addition to that aspect that would reduce somebody's risk or the fire risk, we also found a huge number of natural benefits where the fires, restored the forest structure. They made it more resilient to climate change. It fostered a lot of beautiful flowers on the forest understory that pollinators love to visit. And also increase the water yield of those watersheds. And so when I think about fire, in the news we hear about these scary, terrible wildfires, but we also have to recognize that fires are a really important ecological process. And so if you were to Google hiking through the Illilouette, the ideal forest, there's an NPR series on that research.
One thing, and we talked about it at the inception of our conversation there towards the beginning, that wildfires are scary. Yes, we all need to do our part in preparing for wildfires, and yes, there needs to be the resources and tools available to fight wildfires, but certainly there is a positive outcome from wildfires as well. Dr. Wilkin, if you could leave everybody with one final statement in terms of your experience with wildfires, what you know, what you think, what would you like to share with our audience as a parting comment?
When it comes to fire, I know that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so I think working together to find solutions before a fire happens is incredibly important. We can make our communities and our natural lands far more resilient to fire, and we should together.
All right. Very good. Well, Dr. Wilkin, do appreciate it. All the best in your continuing good work out there in the Golden State. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome, Bill. Have a great day.
One more time, thank you to Dr. Wilkin. Ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Count me as on board with that sentiment. Look to the episode description, by the way, for the reference Dr. Wilkin mentioned. Let's continue. If you look at Dr. Wilkin's reference, you may notice, and not surprisingly, a name, Dr. Jon Keeley. Our next guest, this gentleman, is a long-time recognized expert on wildfires. His name is known both in California and well beyond. And Dr. Keeley is a busy man. As a matter of fact, it was literally tremendous good fortune. I was so pleasantly surprised that we were able to reach him. He's a senior research scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey and an adjunct professor at UCLA, former program director at the National Science Foundation, recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, and is a fellow of the Ecological Society of America. And relevant to our discussion, Dr. Keeley's robust research includes global change impacts on wildfires, ecological life history strategy of plants for fire-prone ecosystems. Did I mention he has over 400 publications? Go ahead, Google his name or travel around YouTube, and you can read and see more on the topic from Dr. Keeley. But here's our conversation.
As I just mentioned, Dr. Keeley now joins us. Just heard from Dr. Kate Wilkin, and Dr. Wilkin did an outstanding job of giving us a foundation in a lead-in to this topic. And Dr. Keeley, clearly you are a noted expert when it comes to this subject matter, talking about wildfires. And one of the things that you've done is you've studied the connection between changes in the climate and wildfire activity. Can you expand upon that?
Sure. We did a fairly extensive study over the last 100 years of how the average temperatures and precipitation in winter, spring, summer, and fall relate to the amount of area that burned within national forests in California, as well as within all the counties in California. And the patterns are very interesting. If you focus on the forest in the Sierra Nevada mountains in Northern California. These are mostly conifer forests, ponderosa pine, and white fir. There is a very strong relationship between spring temperatures and summer temperatures and the amount of area that burns in a given year. And that's with over 100 years of data. So we feel pretty confident that climate is an important driver of fire activity in those forested landscapes. What was a little surprising to us, though, is once you get down in lower elevations, the foothills and coastal areas in California, we don't find any relationship between climate and fire activity. And we believe this is primarily because in these lower elevation areas, it's hot enough and dry enough every year because we have a predictable summer drought that occurs from about May to October every year. So we believe that in these lower elevation areas, it's always hot enough and dry enough for a big fire, and that's why we don't see a strong relationship between climate and fire.
Drought here in Texas, our studios in Austin, drought obviously is something that we're accustomed to. I've lived in the Austin area for, 25 plus years, and at times we will go 45 to 60 days without a drop of rain. And as I mentioned in my visit with Dr. Wilkin, the Bastrop Complex fire back in 2011, that was during drought conditions, and even the fire that we had, Scenic Brook Fire, not too long ago. Again, it was during a period of very dry weather, and then in one case, the Scenic Brook Fire, it was a case of a horrible mistake made by a person leaving a fire unattended, and the Bastrop Fire, as I mentioned earlier with Dr. Wilkin, was caused due to a power line issue. Now, talking about climate and wildfire activity, that's probably a good segue, Dr. Keeley. You've raised the important point how not all wildfire situations are created equal. Acts of people are involved. Population shifts as well are a part of the wildfire story. You've pointed out how Northern California is markedly different than Southern California, and here in Texas, of course, Texas looks quite different than California, Colorado, etc. So how exactly are wildfires influenced by geography and people?
Well, the primary impact of geography in the state is lower elevations generally get very little lightning activity. And as a consequence, humans dominate the source of ignitions for fires. So, for example, coastal California, both up and down the state, coastal areas, 99% of the fires are started by people. But you get into the mountains in the Sierra Nevada and Northern California, lightning is the dominant source, and typically 60 to 70% of the fires will be started by lightning in those higher elevation areas. So humans in the lower elevation area play a huge role simply because there is relatively little lightning activity. In fact, across the U.S., coastal California has probably the lowest lightning activity of any place in the country. And it also has some of the largest metropolitan areas in terms of population. And as a consequence, humans dominate the fire scene in coastal California. And they are the real concern, I think, in most people's minds about looking towards the future. How do we get a handle on fires in those areas? And a lot of it should focus on how to prevent fires that are started by people. And I don't just mean intentional ignitions like arson fires, but a lot of our fires are accidental due to human infrastructure, for example, power lines. And typically in California, and we certainly saw it this past year, the worst fires are ignited by power lines that either are blown down or they arc or a transformer malfunctions and ignites the fire. And the reason power lines are associated with our worst fires is power lines are generally the source of ignition during extreme wind events. And we have extreme winds in the autumn every year throughout the state. They'll last for 2 or 3 days typically. And those winds maybe blow 50, 60 miles per hour with very low humidity, maybe 5% relative humidity. Autumn is the end of our annual drought, and that's what's particularly dangerous in California is we have a predictable annual drought. Now, throughout the world, drought is very often associated with fire events, but in most parts of the world, drought is not an annual event. It'll occur maybe several times a decade, but it doesn't occur every year. In our part of the world, every single year we have a drought for 4 to 6 months. And at the end of that drought period in the autumn, we have these extreme wind events, and they very often will cause power lines to malfunction and ignite fires. And it appears that the big fires in the Bay Area above San Francisco in October of last year were the result of many power line failures that happened due to the extreme winds that were occurring at the time.
You mentioned power lines, you mentioned wind, and as I pointed out a moment ago, that was part of the formula for the Bastrop Complex fire, again, 7 years ago or so. And one thing I know that you've campaigned for is in fire-prone areas, putting the power lines underground. Is that meeting a lot of resistance? When you bring that up, well, what's the response you get?
Well, most utility companies that we've talked with in California are very resistant to the idea of underground power lines. They claim that it's too expensive to put them underground, and it's also very expensive to maintain them, and so they're very much against it. But also they're against it because they think there are better ways to deal with the fire issue. For example, San Diego County in 2007, we had a number of power line failures that caused fires, and they were sued for substantial amounts of money. And I don't offhand recall the amount exactly, but it was upwards of $100 million in lawsuits. In response to those lawsuits, San Diego Gas and Electric Company has started a program where they're going to monitor wind throughout the county. And they have installed, I guess, close to 200 weather stations on their power lines or on power poles throughout the county. And then they monitor them in real time. They have a room where they can observe the wind speed in several hundred places around the county. And their plan is that when wind speeds reach a particular level, they will turn the power grid off on that part of the county. And that's their idea of how to prevent power line ignited fires. It's been somewhat controversial because there are a lot of downsides to doing that. For example, people don't necessarily like having their power cut off, but also there's potential lawsuits that could stem from turning the power off. For example, many of these areas are rural areas, and people obtain their water from wells, and they have to pump the water. So if the electric got turned off, they potentially would be without water and wouldn't be able to perhaps defend themselves if a fire did threaten their house. And then there's just a lot of other potential problems by turning the power off. One of the number one things that concerns me is if people in rural areas realize that during high wind events their power is going to be turned off, they're likely to start investing in gas-powered generators. And gas-powered generators definitely have been known to ignite fire. So they potentially could cause fire problems that way, although from the utility company's perspective, they wouldn't necessarily be responsible for generator-caused fires.
A moment ago, we were talking about population shifts, and in terms of our audience, I assume that there are many people listening to this conversation, to the podcast, who have traveled to LA, to San Diego, to San Francisco throughout the the state of California, but you see how those metro areas have expanded so much over the years. I've been traveling out to California for 2 to 3 decades or so, and it's amazing every time I fly into LAX. And I pointed out to you, I believe, Dr. Keeley, yesterday that I was at UCLA a few weeks ago, and I stood on campus, and I was in the northern part of campus, and you look across the street there, and you see Bel Air, those multi-million-dollar homes, and wildfires aren't biased on where they occur. I mean, everybody knows, of course, Bel Air, Malibu, you're talking multi-million-dollar homes, and Bel Air's been impacted by wildfire. 1961, I think many have seen the images of Burt Lancaster and Zsa Zsa Gabor and former President Richard Nixon hosing down their roofs, and Skirball went through Bel Air. I guess it was last year, Skirball hit the Bel Air area. So wildfires don't discriminate on where they break out, do they?
No, not at all. And in California, I think your focus is right about one of our major concerns has to be population growth. In looking towards the future, in my mind, population growth is probably one of our biggest threats to wildfires, and probably is a bigger threat than global warming, at least in coastal California. Like I said earlier, it appears that most years we have hot enough and dry enough conditions to produce catastrophic fires. So if temperatures get warmer, it may not cause dramatic changes in fires. But since 99% of the fires are started by people, and the prediction is that in the next 30 years, we're going to get a 50% increase in population. And so you think LA is crowded now, wait until 2050, and it'll be substantially denser. And so in my mind, population growth is probably one of our number one concerns in terms of future fire activity. And unless we get a handle on controlling population levels, we're potentially only going to see worse and worse disasters in the future.
So, Dr. Keeley, we've touched on the power companies and their stake in this. A moment ago, we were just talking about population growth in areas potentially impacted by wildfires. You've been involved in the discussion on both a local and national level as well for quite some time. Right now, today, as we sit here in June of 2018, what are the biggest holes in the country's current national wildfire policy and management? Not just California, but as you look across the United States of America, what do we need to do better?
Well, I think if we want to address the issue of how do we reduce catastrophic fires, the number one thing we have to realize is the answer is going to be different in different parts of the country. In more remote parts of the western U.S., where population density is relatively low, the answer is likely to be very different than in denser areas. For example, we did an analysis across North America on the impact of climate and fire activity, and generally what we found was there was an inverse relationship with population density. As the density of humans increased, the importance of climate decreased in terms of determining whether or not you had a big fire event. So that's the one thing to keep in mind, is the answer will be different in different parts of the country of what we can do to minimize catastrophic fires. For example, in much of California, where people ignite most of our fires, I'm of the opinion that our number one approach to dealing with fires should be better fire prevention. There's every reason to believe that there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of preventing fires, and power lines are just one example. But there's also, a lot of fires that are intentionally ignited or accidentally through power equipment or cars igniting fires along roadsides. There are a lot of potential avenues for reducing the incidence of fires themselves. So in my mind, that's the one thing that we should focus on the most in areas where there's high population, is try and improve fire prevention. But in more remote areas, for example, in the Sierra Nevada forest, population density is much lower, and humans are responsible for, probably fewer than 50% of all the fires in those forests. One of the things that those forests, though, need is better control of fuels in the forested environment. And that's primarily because throughout the U.S., the approach to dealing with fires has, for the last century, been to put out fires, just the fire suppression policy of trying to eliminate fires. And that policy has been differentially effective depending on where you are in the country. For example, in coastal California, we have not effectively eliminated fires at all with fire suppression policy. We have probably, in fact, more fires in the last 100 years than we did historically in those coastal areas. But you get into the Sierra Nevada mountains, and fire suppression has been highly effective. And it's been successful in terms of eliminating fires. But the downside of eliminating fires in those forests is we've had an unusual accumulation of dead fuels which alter the behavior of fires. So, for example, in the Sierra Nevada forest, historically, lightning was the primary cause of fires, and it happened fairly frequently. We have good estimates that suggest that historically fires occurred every 10 to 20 years, and these are very productive forests, so the trees can actually grow quite tall, and in a sense, they outgrow the fuels which are on the ground, and so when fires historically occurred, they burned in the dead fuels in the understory, and they didn't burn the forest down. But with 100 years of successful fire suppression, we now have an accumulation of surface fuels to the point where those forests are threatened with much more severe fires that can take out the entire forest. So this success that we call fire suppression has really a downside, and it reminds me of a comment that this newscaster Eric Severide back in the 1960s used to say, most problems begin as solutions, and that's certainly the case in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The solution was to eliminate fire. By eliminating fire, you eliminated an important ecosystem process, which was cleaning out the understory of the forest, keeping the fuels down. And this problem is now far worse than it ever was.
Dr. Keeley, it's certainly a problem, certainly an issue that we're going to keep an eye on here. And with July, August, September looming on the horizon, we do appreciate, respect the fact that you're very busy, and thank you again for spending some time with us.
Okay, Bill. Good to talk to you.
Again, Doctors Jon Keeley and Kate Wilkin, not bragging, but how's that for a guest lineup? By the way, as with Dr. Wilkin, see the episode description for a number of valuable, relevant resources shared by Dr. Keeley. And by the way, if you know of someone in a wildfire-prone area or may be interested in the conversations we just had, be a friend and share the episode. So that's going to do it for this episode. Thanks a lot for taking a second to download, share, and follow the Big Bid Theory. You can send me an email at bcallhane@bidprime.com. Jim's email addy is jward@bidprime.com. On Twitter, give us a follow at The Big Bid Theory. Unless you're a Russian bot, we'll follow back. My Twitter is contract_hunter. Jim's handle is jward6, jward6. And don't forget to like our Facebook page as well. Many thanks for that. Powered by Bid Prime, on behalf of our stellar TBBT staff, I hope things go swimmingly for Lauren. Roughly 90%, far too many wildfires are caused by humans. Be smart and be careful out there. Thanks again to Dr. Wilkin and Dr. Keeley. For Jim Ward, I'm Bill Culhane. Until next time, learn about wildfires. The life and home you save could be your own. Go Gunners, Barracudas, Tigers, Bobcats, and Cubs. And we wish you all the best in growing your business.
We're having so much fun, so much fun.